Welcome to the Gloves Are Off Overtime Edition. I'm Moses Woldu. I'm pleased to be joined by these two guys, Greg Buchanan.
Hey, Moses.
And Brandan Bosler.
How you doing?
Not too bad, of course. On our show, we can get to all the questions, but we can now. We'll start off with a question I like to start is baseball, because of course the postseason's here. You have John Gibbons, the Toronto Blue Jays. They should have been in the game against either Kansas City or Oakland, but of course a second half collapse prevented that. John Gibbons was talking about giving his assessment on the Toronto Blue Jays on a local sports show, and said, you know what, they're not a tight-knit group. If there's anything that's an issue, it's just that they're not as close, and they couldn't really overcome some of the certain things they did. What do you make of those comments by their manager, the Blue Jays manager, John Gibbons?
I think what they couldn't overcome was some key injuries to some key players at a key time. That's Brett Laurie, that's Edwin Encarnacion, who was just crushing home runs before he went out. You took those two bats out of the lineup. Adam Lind was out. I think their biggest downfall was injuries at a bad time. They didn't have the depth to fill those gaps. And you mentioned how well the team's getting along, more or less. You know, they weren't happy or they didn't get along good enough.
They weren't close-knit. And of course,
what makes a close-knit team?
Is winning.
You find a team that's dead last in any league, they're probably not the most close-knit team.
But you know what?
There's
also another thing that makes you close-knit is motivation. If you have a guy down, everyone says we'll have to do it by committee. Knowing, and you just mentioned, when you lose Encarnacion, you lose a big bat like that, you have a Band-Aid at third base with Brett Laurie. Laurie can be replaced.
Edwin Encarnacion is not replaceable by Danny Valencia, okay? No, on any major league team.
The thing is, the word that comes out of Toronto right now is culture. And I really hate using that term of it's bad culture in the room. Bad culture comes from two things. Lack of leadership as players. Players have to take accountability in the room, and winning. And both of those can be fixed. If you bring in some good leaders on that team and you start winning, well, all of a sudden your culture's a lot better.
Is Jose Bautista a good leader?
No, I don't think so.
He's kind of a selfish player. He's a heck of a baseball player, but there's a lot of good leaders. How many games did Derek Jeter get ejected from in his career? 0. How many times did Jose Bautista get ejected this year?
Yeah.
You know, he puts his team in bad positions. Another thing I want to say about the Blue Jays, because this kind of ticks me off, is at the trade deadline, everyone was mad they didn't make a move. You know who else didn't make a move? The Kansas City Royals. They were below the Jays at the trade deadline. And they're hosting a playoff game tonight. So that excuse doesn't work for me anymore.
Okay, what about this, guys? What do you think of hockey players who are still playing in the NHL, very young, having their number retired by their junior A major junior club? Case in point, Jonathan TAVARES, who has his number 91 retired by the Oshawa Generals over the weekend. What do you guys make of that?
You know what? I've seen it through the Western Hockey League. There's a kid by the name of Glenn Goodall who played in Seattle since the age of 15 until he was 20. Went on and played pros. Didn't really click in the pros, unlike Johnny T. But and he had his number retired shortly after he was done in Seattle. So I think if he contributed a lot to the Oshawa Generals during his time there, and he deserves to get his number retired, then he rightly should.
So there's no real age limit, they should say.
No,
I thought maybe it was just a little too young, premature. You're talking about his major junior career. It's not his NHL career. But I mean, like there's got to be a certain limit or time where you're like, okay, we'll do it. Not saying you shouldn't be retiring Tavares' number. I think maybe just a little too
I feel
early.
like he was one of the best junior players of all time, right? He was the first exception, was he not, to get into the draft young because he was so good.
With the OHL. Yeah. And of course,
and then Aaron
he also broke the scoring record for Mark Gretzky, who was held quite some time.
I said Ekblad, I meant McDavid, the other exception.
Yeah.
Like he was an exception. He was a standout. I mean, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. What's the difference when it is?
Sunday, of course, it's all about NFL football. Well, after the weeks were done, San Francisco Giants managed to come back and beat the Philadelphia Eagles, much to the relief of Jim Harbaugh. However, Deion Sanders, with an NFL-owned television channel, came out and said, look, I've talked to some of the guys in San Fran. They tell me they don't want this guy here. They want him out. They don't want to play for him. They've tuned him out. On the next following day, the Monday, Jim Harbaugh said that's just a bunch of crap. Yeah. Who do you believe, and do you feel that maybe when there's smoke, there's fire, Jim Harbaugh?
Oh, you know what? I really hate when stories like that get leaked out, and I don't know if you blame the players, that because you always tell the players and you always discuss with the players that anything that happens in your dressing room stays in your dressing room. And I think Dion and some of the media types now that are former players that have the ability to talk to current players and then use it as a media member, I really have a hard time with that stuff.
Yeah, I hate stories like this.
You hate them, but do you feel there's some credence to it?
I don't know what goes on in the room. I don't know. The guy's a good coach. They were in 3 NFC championship games in a row. Okay, we're going to blame that all that they didn't win the Super Bowl and just him?
But I'm
I
just
mean,
saying,
the head coach
but
takes a big chunk.
But it's not just that. I'm talking about now. Sometimes after a while, you know this, Greg, and you said it plenty of times on the show, that sometimes you'll have players who tune a person out. John Tortorella, a prime example of that. Not saying Jim Harbaugh is the type of yelling coach or use that motivation, but after a while, the same stuff that you use to motivate players doesn't motivate them anymore.
You know, and it does. And Harbaugh's been there for a while, and the message can kind of sound like Charlie Brown's teacher after a while because it's the yelling and it's in the face, and it works to a point, but after a while...
They need a refresher.
They need a refresher. Now, does it mean they have to change head coach, or do they change out the players? 9 times out of 10, you know it's going to happen. It's going to be the coach.
All right, guys, how about this one? Eli Manning has thrown for 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception in his last 2 games. Had that great performance against the Washington Redskins on Thursday Night Football. Then on the other side, you had Tony Romo the following Sunday taking on the New Orleans Saints. And we all know you can't mess around with Drew Brees and the Saints. However, it was Tony Romo and his offense that led the charge. Doesn't hurt when you have DeMarco Murray, who's leading the team in rushing. But Tony Romo, 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception since his 3 interception performance in Week 1. Out of those 2 quarterbacks, who's likely to keep that streak going?
No,
I think Romo is more likely to keep it going.
Reason?
I really do. Eli's always made bad decisions in my mind. He's been a guy who's thrown a lot of interceptions. You look at Tony Romo, he's got a lot of weapons. There's a lot of quarterbacks in the NFL that would love to have the receivers he does. Like some of the catches that Des Bryant makes, like...
Yeah, he has more weapons than Eli has in New York, no doubt about that. But the funny thing is, Eli, after that first couple of games, they were not too happy in New York, and they were thinking that, you know, we're going to have to find somebody else besides Eli. But, you know, be patient with the guy. And Eli got him a Super Bowl victory. Twice. What's Tony done in Dallas?
Only
He did
1
carry
playoff
Underwood
victory.
for a while.
1 playoff victory. So
well, that's might consider some might consider that a championship in itself.
And Tony, too, you know, I know he had a great game on Sunday, but he played against the New Orleans Saints team. That there is the Saints team that plays on the road, then there's a Saints team that plays at home. Their home team is pretty good. Their road team is horrible.
You know what, though? I do got to give him credit. The Saints' defense is pretty good. Their defense was awful a few years ago. Their defense was ranked 4th in the NFL last year. That was not a bad defense that he lit up. So I give him credit.
I say it doesn't hurt when you have DeMarco Murray because they've evolved the ground game that alleviates pressure on Tony Romo, knowing that defenses don't have to pick on him all the time. But again, it's now September. We have to wait till October before we actually, and November, December, to see what happens. All right, guys, thanks again, Greg, as well as you, Brandan, for stopping by. Love to have you on once again. And thank you for joining us on the overtime edition on Gloves. You can tune in every Tuesday night, 7:30 on CITL, and then go to our Facebook page for the questions we didn't get to on our show. In the meantime, we will see you in 7 days.